Hey folks, welcome in. This is Chris with Alpenglow Digital, and in today's video, we are kicking off part 1 in our series aimed at helping you create your very first Power Apps form. This video and series are aimed at folks who are learning Power Apps for the very first time. So our video is going to go over how to create a SharePoint list, how to add custom fields or columns. SharePoint's going to act as our backend or database, if you will, for this project. We are then going to connect SharePoint to your very first Power Apps Canvas app, which will allow you to create a custom form. This doesn't look pretty now. I promise in future videos it gets better. We're going to go over how to connect your data, how to add your fields, how to ultimately add a submit button, which will allow users to use this form and submit to your SharePoint list. So without further ado, let's go. Alrighty, here we are in SharePoint. SharePoint for our project is going to act as our database or backend, if you will. You can connect to a lot of different data sources through Power Apps. You can connect to a SQL database. You can connect to Dataverse, or SharePoint is one of our favorites because it's nice and lightweight. It's easy to edit. A lot of folks, especially if you're a Microsoft shop, probably are familiar with at least navigating SharePoint and have probably used SharePoint lists before. So come into the SharePoint site that you would like to be the home for your list. And if you have the right permissions, you'll see the opportunity to add a new list here at the top. And you can start from an existing list, which is great. If you're maybe upgrading something and you have an old list that you want to reference, you can do that. Import some fields from Excel. There's also a lot of awesome templates, but in our case, we are going to start from a blank list, and we're going to call it Event Planning Requests. We'll call it that. I'm not going to show it on the site navigation, and I'm going to hit Create. This may take SharePoint a second. That was actually pretty quick. And you'll be taken to your list. The only column that SharePoint is going to give you out of the box is the title. And we are now going to go add our own fields. To add our own fields, you can either click Add Column and do things this way. This is a little bit tricky. I think the UI is a little bit cluttered personally. And so what I like to do is come up to the top right, hit List Settings. And this looks very old-fashioned, but this is the way I prefer. It'll show you all of your columns here that SharePoint gives you by default. So we saw title before. SharePoint also right out of the box is going to give you modified and created fields. These are timestamps denoting when a SharePoint list item was initially created and when it was most recently modified. And created by and modified by will show you the person that created and or modified them most recently. So to add your own column, you're going to hit Create Column. And we are going to be a fake event planning company. So I want to have, in addition to a title, I want to have a description. And the type of information in this column, I'm trying to anticipate what folks might put into this column. It's going to be longer than a single line of text, which I think is capped at 255 characters. And it's going to be multiple lines of text, so folks can explain a little bit more in depth what the event is all about. Lines of editing, 6. I'm going to change this to plain text so that folks can't add weird things like hyperlinks or tables or pictures, because I just want a simple description of what the event is. I'm going to click OK. We are going to go down here. You can see it added description right under title. We're going to go down here and add date and time. This is going to be a date and time column type. And this will give folks a nice little calendar picker and then also an hour and minute picker in Power Apps when we get there. I'm going to say date and time. Standard format is fine. Again, you can augment a little bit of this in Power Apps. No default value here. That looks good. Press OK. Next, we are going to do the type of event. Type of event. You can see that I've practiced this once before. And it's going to be a choice column, which by default will allow a user to pick one item from a list. You can see some options down here that allow them to select multiple options. But in our case, it is just going to be a single option. It can be a wedding, an anniversary party, or a birthday party, let's say. And I'm going to keep that as drop-down menu. I'm not going to have a default choice, but if you wanted one, you can have one here. It'll default to the very first item in your list. And I'm going to clear that out and press OK. And the last column that we're going to add for now is the number of guests. Number of guests, and we're going to make this a number column. You could have this be a choice column, 1 to 25, 26 to 50. Just pick the column and information type that makes the most sense for your use case. In this case, I'm just going to do a simple number column. And I am not at the moment going to do anything about required. You can set minimum, maximum values for numbers. I'm not going to touch any of that. All right. So we've got our title, description, date and time, type event, number of guests. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to modify the title column that SharePoint gave us, and I'm going to call it the event title because I think that's a little bit more descriptive of what we're after. When you do end up referencing this title in Power Apps or even sometimes elsewhere in SharePoint, you still might see it come through as just plain title, even if you have renamed it. But that's okay. It's referencing this particular column. And that does it for SharePoint. All right, welcome to Power Apps. Now that we have our SharePoint list, it's time to make a pretty front-end form that we can share with users so that folks don't need to go into SharePoint directly to submit requests. So if you head on over to make.powerapps.com, you will see something like this. Alternatively, you can go up here to the top left and see all of the applications that you have access to as part of your Microsoft 365 subscription. This is a quick, easy way to get to something like Power Automate or Power Apps. And from here, you will land on the Power Apps homepage. This is an opportunity to kind of create an app almost any way you'd like. Oftentimes you'll start with a data source, whether it be Dataverse, SharePoint, something else. You can take a look at designs for your app or a template that's the kind of created ahead of time for you. This is a great place to start if you just need design inspiration. And I haven't had a ton of success yet using AI, but as you can imagine, AI will only become more and more tightly integrated with Microsoft products over the years. So what I will do is go to the apps section of Power Apps. This is a spot where you will see all of the apps that you have currently, as well as ones that maybe team members have created and shared with you. There are a number of new ways that you can create a new Power App form. If you click New App up here or New App down here, you'll see the same options. You can start with your data. If you know ahead of time, I'm going to use Dataverse, SharePoint, something else, page designs, or there's actually a lot of awesome app templates. I'll show you just a preview of those really quickly. If you know that, hey, I have a specific use case, maybe I need to create an onboarding app or an opportunity for folks to submit leave requests that I can review. The out-of-the-box templates are great, but they are a little bit overwhelming for folks that may be brand new to Power Apps because there's a lot of things that are already baked into them, and it just requires a little bit of knowledge ahead of time to be able to modify things appropriately. So what we're going to do is actually just start with page design, and we're just going to do a plain blank canvas app. So the simplest thing you can do in Power Apps. This will take a second to load. And once we're in here, we are inside the Power Apps Studio. So right off the bat, it's going to ask me if I want to create a form or a gallery. A gallery is often a view of a list. In our case, if we're using SharePoint, it may be an opportunity to see all of the items within that SharePoint list. But we are going to create a form a different way. So from Power Apps, on the left-hand side is the tree view. This is going to show you all of the components within your apps. So Power Apps is divided into screens, if you will. If you're thinking about like a website, there are different pages within the website. In a future video, we may cover an application that's a little bit more complicated that might have various screens. We'll talk about transitioning between screens and the like. But for now, we're just focused on a simple Power Apps form using SharePoint. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create a connection between this Power Apps form and our data. In this case, it's SharePoint. So on the left-hand side here, it's just a quick navigation. Tree views here at the top. If you wanted to insert things like components, they're here, and data is our third option. So I want to add a data connection type. And it's going to say, hey, what type of connection is this? Is this to Dataverse? Is it to SharePoint? In our case, it is to SharePoint. I will select that. Connect directly. And then it's going to ask for the SharePoint site where your list is housed. So in our case, it's the Event Planning Assistance site. And then it'll automatically pull in kind of the folders and lists and other things that you have on the site by default. So here's the list we just created, Event Planning Requests. We're going to click Connect. And so nothing has really happened visually for us, but we do see now in our data tab, we have a connection to the SharePoint list in question. So now we can actually add the form. So if you go to Insert, you will see all of the options to add components to your screen, to your application, if you will. And if you type in form, you will see all of the options for forms. Some of these have been deprecated. Some of these are premium features, which you or your users may not have a license for. And so for the most part, we're going to look at display and edit forms. So in our case, we do want this to be an edit form because our users are going to be actually adding information and then ultimately submitting. But if you wanted to just create a view where somebody could go through maybe like a gallery and see what items had been submitted but not edit them, you could use a display form. So we are going to use an edit form. This will add it to your app, and then right away it'll say, hey, you need to add some data to this. And lo and behold, here's our SharePoint connection. We'll give that a second and it will add all of our data. Once our data is finished connecting, you will see all of the fields from your list pre-populated in your form. So like most other online WYSIWYG editors, you can move things around, you can change the dimensions of them. There are a lot of things that you can do with styling that we'll delve into in a future video. For now, let's take a look at the tree view. So this has our screen, which was here initially, and then our form's been added. And you can see we now have kind of cards, if you will, for each of our SharePoint list fields, all contained within this form. So we're going to do a couple basic things. I'd like this form to be full width. So I can click over here, I can drag, and for the time being, we're going to make it full width and full height. To help keep spacing consistent within your form, you have the ability to snap to columns over here on the right. This is the properties pane. This will show you some high-level information about display properties in this case, and then at some point we will dive into the more advanced properties, such as what happens when the form is successfully submitted or reset, or things like that. So for now, on the display pane, we want to ensure that snap to columns is on. This will say, hey, if you've made any changes, just know that they might get modified now that you're asking to snap. And you can specify the columns across, if you will, up to 12. And so if it's 1, that means you can only have 1 item per row, essentially. If it's 2, that means each card can take up 50%, 3, 33%, and so on. Often what I like to do is set this to the maximum, and that gives me the most flexibility as I'm resizing my fields. Some fields I know may take up a lot more space than others, and so in some cases just maybe 2 or 3 columns is enough. In other cases like description, you know that field's going to be quite lengthy, and so you might want that to be a little bit larger. And so having flexibility with your column layout is great. If snap to columns is off, then you can size things by hand, and it's just a little bit tricky to get things to line up, and it can look a little bit funky. So I would recommend keeping snap to columns on if you'd like. In a future video, we will take a look at styling things more in depth so we can really make this form look pretty. But for now, we're just going to get a simple form set up and ensure that the user can add all their information and then ultimately submit it. So my event title, I'm just going to make a little bit bigger. The description, I want that to be a little bit bigger. So when you get to the end here and you can't drag any more to the right, if you drag to the left, it will essentially take up more space, and then you come back over here and drag it to the right. So I've got my event description, date and time. I'm going to give that this is maybe equivalent to like 3 or 4 columns. Number of guests, we'll make that the same. And I'm realizing now that SharePoint gave us another default field, which I actually don't see in the list, but it did show up, which is content type. It's not something we need to be concerned with. So if you select the card and then press delete, it will be removed from the form. And so now we just have our 5 fields. A great feature about Power Apps Studio, and something you'll probably use quite a bit, is the ability to essentially live preview your application. So we have our form here. Granted, we don't have a title yet, we don't have a submit button, but if you wanted to preview it, you can come up here to the top and click the preview button. And when you do that, if you are just creating a form for the first time, you will notice that nothing displays. So we can exit out of here. The reason that nothing displays has to do with our default mode for our form. So on the right here, you will see the default mode is set to edit. So when you play the app, the Power App is saying, hey, I should have some data here to display that the user can then edit. And in our case, we don't have any data to display. So what we want to do is come back into our form, go to our default mode, and set this to new, which tells Power App, render the form. There's going to be no existing data. We are asking a user to input something for the first time. So now when we play, you can come in here and add data just like you would if the form were live. You can set the date and time. Unfortunately, the out-of-the-box date and time picker in Power Apps today is defaulted to military time, so you'll see up to 23 hours and then 59 minutes. We will cover in a future video how to make this a little bit more user-friendly, since I think most folks won't use or prefer military time. Here's our drop-downs for type of event and number of guests. So it's just a great way to see what the end user might see without having to go and publish your app and look at it that way. So the preview button is great. Use it often. So we have one big missing piece, and that is we have no way for the user to be able to submit something. So they can fill out the form, but they can't submit it yet. So what we want to do is give them a submit button. So we can come in here and hit insert and then button. Now what this is going to do is it's going to place the button anywhere in your application that you want. And this is an okay solution if you know exactly how your application is going to be used and viewed. We always want to be mindful of how something is going to look on a desktop application like I'm using now, or if you anticipate somebody filling this out on their phone. And what this is going to do is if you add the button that way, it's going to keep this kind of in a static location, which will make it really tricky if folks are using different screen sizes. You may end up having the button overlap one of your fields, and it's kind of a clunky experience. So while you can do it that way, what I want to cover briefly is adding it to the form itself. On the right-hand side, we have the properties for the form. You can see all of the fields that SharePoint has and that Power Apps added by default. If you click them, you will see all of them again. And the three little ellipses up here will allow you to add a custom card. So as we talked about before, all of these fields already have their own cards, and we can add a custom card which will not be connected to any data initially. So you can see it added it right down here on the left. So now when I have that card selected, if I click insert and button, it adds that button inside the card. And so what's nice is you can see I can't drag it out. What's nice is if we were looking at this on a mobile device and these fields are all collapsed into a single column, this would get pushed down to the bottom and it would remain visible, which is great. It's now time to get our button actually set up to submit. So if you look here on the right, these are the properties of this button. You can change a lot of things like font, font size, color, things like that. You can also change the text or what appears inside the button. So instead of saying button, I want it to say submit. You'll see that change here. And at the moment, if I were to preview this, I can click this and of course nothing happens. So if you come back, select the button, the display properties are going to be largely just styling. And then if you see the advanced tab over here, this is where you can add a little bit more sophisticated logic to the button itself. You can dictate what happens when it's selected. You can also change other interesting things with the design. Many of these can be changed from the other pane, but this is just a little bit more in-depth look at things like padding or border radius or height. So in our case, what we care about is here at the top. So at the moment, this is set to false. And so when you click on it, you will see nothing. Quick tidbit, instead of previewing the app here, you can also hold the Alt key to make it live and previewable without leaving the screen. So I can click here while holding the Alt key. Let's update our onSelect property. There are a few spots that you can do this. On the right-hand side, we have our property, we have on select. What I like to do is instead of using this little space to enter my formulas, I really like to use the formula bar here at the top. So on the left here, you will see a big long list, and this list provides you a quick way to access all of the properties that you see both in the display pane and the advanced pane. So if you wanted to see something like what font is being used, you can easily do that instead of going to the display pane and finding the font. And if you come over here and click on a property like on select, then it will make that the active property. So for example, text now is the active property. It shows that it's called submit. For on select, we want this to not be false and instead submit our form. Power Apps, just like other Microsoft products like Excel, come with a lot of great functions right out of the box, including one to submit your form. So if you type submit, you will see the submit form function pop up. You can press tab, and then it's going to ask you for the form name that you want to submit. In our case, our form is just called Form 1, which was the default name given by Power Apps. So if I type Form 1 and then close it out, you will see that there are no errors. If you did type an incorrect form, say Form 2, which doesn't exist, Power Apps does give you a little bit of visual feedback that it says, hey, there's probably an issue here. If you click this and go to Edit in Formula Bar, it will show you the formula up here at the top that's questionable or problematic. So in our case, incorrect form name, changes back to Form 1, and there are no errors, so we are good to go. All right, now that we have a submit button, let's actually try to submit something. This is going to be for a winter wedding, a super awesome winter wedding in Washington State. It is going to take place here at the end of February, and it's going to be a morning wedding for some reason. A wedding, and we are expecting 100 people. And let's submit and see what happens. So you'll notice that we get the no item to display again, and that's because we've now submitted what was a new form, and we haven't asked Power Apps to do anything other than actually submit the form. So in future videos, we'll show how to navigate to another screen or page that says, hey, your request has been submitted successfully. Would you like to go submit another request, for example? We'll have this experience be better for users eventually. But for now, let's see if it actually submitted. So I'm coming back to my SharePoint list and I refreshed, and now we see that our submission is here. And so if I were on the processing end of things, I would see, hey, I got a new request. What's it for? Take a look at it. Oh, it's a winter wedding. Great. In the next video, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into styling. We'll also help the submit button reset the form as well as take the user to a success screen. But for now, let's say you are happy with your form. You want to save it up here in the top right. What would you like to call it? Event planning intake form. It did take a few minutes, but eventually we have our new app appearing here in our apps list. If you wanted to play it, this is kind of the same way you would preview it, but you can actually play it in the full Power Apps experience. You can click here. It'll say, hey, by the way, we're going to use a data connection of sorts in order to use this, which makes sense. This is SharePoint. I said, okay, sounds good. And I can use this application, hit submit, just like we could when you previewed, which is great. Now, if you want to send this to somebody, you can go into here and more options and look at details. Details will give you a lot of information about the versions, maybe the connections that are being used within the app, and here is the web link you care about. So if you click copy, open a new tab, and send this, you will see your application here. And with that said, you have your very first Power App form. One thing you do want to be mindful of is out of the box, this will not necessarily be shared with everybody in your tenant or environment. So if you do need to share it, you can go right up here, and then you can add folks or distribution groups or security groups here. Click share. They will get an email that says, hey, you've been granted access. What I prefer to do sometimes is use the classic sharing. This will allow you to do a couple different things more easily. You can add folks, and then you can also specify whether or not they are a co-owner of the app. If they are a co-owner, they will have the ability to see the application in their own Power Apps list, and then they can go in and actually edit it. You can also very easily toggle or untoggle the email invite that it would send to folks. So if I'm proactively granting access to a lot of folks, I don't really need them to know about it right now. I will uncheck this and then click share. This wraps up part 1 of our series, building your very first Power Apps form. In part 2, we're going to delve a little bit further into styling. We're going to look at adding maybe a title to your form, changing maybe some of the fonts and the colors. We're also going to take a look at required fields. How do you make fields in your form required? How do you ensure that your form's not submitted prematurely, that it has all of the required fields? And we're also going to create a nice experience that when your form is submitted, the user is taken to a success screen where they get some visual confirmation that their submission has been received, and then they have an opportunity to maybe go and resubmit another one. So stick around for part 2. Thanks for watching.